Arch Disability Law Centre presents the Accessible Canada Act, Accessibility Regulations and Standards.
Hi everyone, my name's Carrie and I'm here with Rachel. We are lawyers. We work at Arch Disability Law Centre. Arch works on disability rights law. With us today is Christine Donato from Communication Disabilities Access Canada. We want to welcome you to our video series. It's about the Accessible Canada Act. This act is a law in Canada. It became law in 2019.
We will be talking about the rules and guidelines that come with the Act. These are called regulations and standards. They are meant to help make our country more accessible and inclusive for people with disabilities and deaf people. We will talk about who has to follow these rules and guidelines.
There are 5 videos in this series. The first video is about the Accessible Canada Act. This is the second video in this series. This second video is about accessibility regulations and standards, or rules and guidelines. The third video is about how the Government of Canada, the Canadian Transportation Agency, and the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission, or the CRTC, make regulations. The fourth video gives tips about how you can give input when new regulations are being made. And the fifth video is about where you can find regulations once they are made and how you might want to use them.
These videos are all available on Arch's website at www.archdisabilitylaw.ca. Each video has a short written summary. These will have the main points of each topic. They will also tell you where to find more information about each topic. These summaries are on Arch's website. We suggest that you watch these videos in order from 1 to 5. That will give you the best understanding of the information.
Accessibility rules are also called accessibility regulations. There are many other regulations that are not called accessibility rules. They still affect people with disabilities and deaf people. It's important for people with disabilities to get involved in making these regulations too. The information in this video can help you understand how to do this. We made these videos with the help of our partners. Our partners are the Canadian Association of the Deaf, Communication Disabilities Access Canada, the Council of Canadians with Disabilities, the National Coalition of People Who Use Guide and Service Dogs in Canada, and People First of Canada. In this video series, we will call the Accessible Canada Act the ACT for short.
Arch has found that there are barriers in the process of making these rules. A barrier includes anything that does not allow people with disabilities to be included in giving input about what these rules should say. A barrier stops people with disabilities from taking part in activities. You can read Arch's recommendations on how to remove these barriers here.
The Act is called a framework law. What does that mean?
This means that making Canada more accessible is the overall goal of the Act. It looks at the big picture. It gives general rules to help achieve accessibility. The Act does not include specific details. It doesn't say what exactly will be done to remove barriers. Some of these specific details are found in regulations and standards. The Act is like a blueprint, which shows a plan for a house. Lawmakers and government offices are the builders. They make regulations and accessibility standards that have rules and guidelines. These are for the federal government, federal businesses, and federal organizations. The Act tells them to make their organizations accessible to everybody. This means making their services accessible, buildings accessible, and it also means making jobs and communications more accessible. It is these rules and guidelines that will help to make the Act real.
Who makes regulations and standards under the law?
The Act gives government agencies the power to make regulations. These agencies are the Federal Government of Canada, the Canadian Transportation Agency, or the Agency for short, and the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission, or the CRTC for short. The Act also made a new organization. It's called Accessibility Standards Canada. This is a government organization. It creates accessibility standards and guidelines.
Tell me more about regulations. What are they?
Accessibility regulations are a set of legal rules. This means they must be obeyed. This set of rules tell businesses, organizations, and the federal government how to become more accessible. If these rules are not obeyed, there may be a fine or punishment.
Can you give me some examples of what regulations might say?
Sure. An accessibility regulation might be about physical accessibility in a building. It might say that there must be automatic door openers. It might say that all doors, hallways, and washrooms must be built to be accessible for people using wheelchairs. Another regulation might be about communication. It might say that staff at federal government programs must be trained to communicate with people with disabilities. An accessibility regulation might say that people who work at Surface Canada need to be able to communicate with someone using a signboard, or that they need to be trained in augmentative and alternative communication methods. Or a regulation could be about transportation. It might say that airlines or railways have to allow people to use guide or service dogs when traveling. These are all examples of what regulations could say. There will also be regulations about how organizations need to plan to become more accessible. The Act tells federal organizations to make accessibility plans. These plans tell how the organization will find and remove barriers. Regulations will say when these plans have to be made public. People with disabilities and deaf people can ask for copies of the plan if they want. You can ask for them in accessible formats. The Act will make organizations get input from people with disabilities and deaf people. There will be consultation and feedback processes put in place. These will give people with disabilities and deaf people a chance to tell organizations how they are doing on accessibility. Regulations will say when organizations have to make their feedback process. The Act says that organizations have to write progress reports. These reports will show how well an organization meets its accessibility goals. Regulations will say how often progress reports need to be done.
Earlier, you told us of the Government of Canada, the Canadian Transportation Agency, and the CRTC make these regulations. What is the difference between the regulations that each of these agencies make?
Each group is responsible for making regulations in different kinds of federal organizations. These organizations work in different areas of life. Each group makes its own accessibility rules. The Government of Canada can make 3 kinds of accessibility rules. The first kind is a set of rules for federal government offices. This includes federal programs like employment insurance. It includes federal government agencies like the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. It also includes some businesses like banks and mining companies. These rules will say how these programs, government agencies, and businesses must become more accessible. The second kind is a set of rules that tell federal organizations when and how to make their own accessibility plans. They tell them how to get input from people with disabilities and deaf people. They also explain how to report on whether they are meeting their accessibility goals. The third kind are rules about penalties and enforcement. These are for organizations that do not follow accessibility laws. These rules mean that federal businesses and organizations will have to do some new things. These things may help increase accessibility. For example, the rules might say that communication facilitators must be provided for court or tribunal hearings. They might have to provide assistive technology that people with disabilities and deaf people use. For example, most deaf people no longer use TTY for communication. This means that having this as the only option for communication may create a barrier. The Canadian Transportation Agency oversees things that have to do with transportation. It can make regulations about what railways, airlines, ferries, and buses that travel between provinces must do to become more accessible. It can also make regulations about how transportation providers make accessibility plans and report on those plans. It may also make regulations about enforcing these rules. These new regulations are meant to remove barriers faced by people with disabilities and deaf people in their everyday life. Let me give you an example of this. Say a deaf person is at an airport. They want to know when a flight is arriving. Now imagine that the airport makes an announcement over their speaker system, changing the time that the flight arrives. They do not put a notice on the written notice board. This means the deaf person has no way of knowing that the flight arrival time has changed. This is a barrier. It's an example of a situation that these accessibility rules could address. The CRTC can make regulations about what radio, television, telephone, and internet providers must do to follow planning and reporting rules in the Act. For example, the CRTC might say what a telephone company has to include in their feedback process. It might say that the feedback process must have a point person who gets all the information from people with disabilities and deaf people. The CRTC might also say when an internet provider has to finish its first accessibility plan or write its progress report. The CRTC also tells radio, television, telephone, and internet providers what they must do to be more accessible. The CRTC doesn't always use regulations to do this. Sometimes it does this by making decisions, orders, and regulatory policies.
What are accessibility standards?
Accessibility standards are a set of guidelines. They explain how to make things more accessible. These things could include information, products, or services. It could also include employment and other areas that can be made more accessible. The Act gives Accessibility Standards Canada the power to make these standards.
Could you please give me some examples of what accessibility standards might say?
An accessibility standard could show how to make a website accessible. It could show what accessible formats can be used to provide information. A standard like this can help remove barriers in information and communication. Another example of an accessibility standard could be in the area of employment or getting a job. It could show how to make accommodation plans. It could explain how to accommodate employees with disabilities and deaf employees.
How are accessibility standards different than regulations?
Accessibility standards are voluntary. They are not regulations. They are not laws. They are a set of guidelines that organizations are encouraged to follow. There's no punishment if an organization chooses not to follow a standard. But a regulation is a legal rule. It must be followed. There could be a punishment if a regulation is not followed.
Could an accessibility standard become a regulation?
Yes, it could. Government can make a standard into a regulation. Accessibility Standards Canada can ask the government to do this. If a standard became a regulation, organizations would have to follow it. There could be a punishment if the regulation is not followed.
Are there other ways to give guidance to organizations about making things more accessible?
Yes, accessibility standards are only one kind of guideline that deals with accessibility. Another kind of guideline is called a guidance document. It might tell government, businesses, and organizations how to follow regulations. The Government of Canada, the Canadian Transportation Agency, and the CRTC sometimes make guidance documents.
Here are some important points to learn from watching this video. The Act gives goals for accessibility. It gives general rules about what federal organizations have to do to make things more accessible. It also says which government offices and lawmakers will make more specific rules. Accessibility regulations or rules tell federal organizations what they must do to remove barriers. These rules give the details on what must be done. The federal government must follow these rules. Federal businesses and organizations must also follow these rules. These regulations are made by the federal government, the Canadian Transportation Agency, and the CRTC. Accessibility standards give guidelines on how to make things more accessible. These standards are voluntary. Federal organizations can choose if they want to follow guidelines. Guidelines are made by Accessibility Standards Canada. They describe how to offer information, products, and services in an accessible way.
We hope you've enjoyed this video. There is more information on regulations in the other videos in this series. The other videos will tell you more about how regulations are made. They will describe how each agency makes its own regulations or rules. This includes the Government of Canada, the Canadian Transportation Agency, and the CRTC. The videos also describe what happens once regulations are made. The videos talk about how people with disabilities and deaf people can give their input when regulations are made. We hope you'll watch the other videos in this series.
ARCH thanks the Government of Canada's Social Development Partnerships Program Disability Component for funding this project. The information in this video materials is not intended to be legal advice. Consult a lawyer or legal worker if you need legal advice on a specific matter. The information in this video is current as of March 31st, 2021.